So our topic is natural selection, evolution and God, how creatures change and why it's not evolution. I should have evolution with a big E. But when it comes to these issues, the glasses you wear affect the way you see things. So hopefully your ears will get tuned to my accent quickly, because you have an accent, not me. Well, most of you are understanding, so that's good. Your glasses affect how you see things. What am I talking about there? I'm talking about the worldview you have. So you can have a secular worldview or a Christian worldview, for example, or a secular worldview that everything made itself, that there's only physics and chemistry operating, God's a figment of our imagination. Christian worldview, of course, there is a real hands-on creator who made things, and because he made things, we're accountable to him. And so really there are only two ways of looking at things, two possibilities. Either things made themselves, or there is an eternal, powerful entity who made everything. And of course, within this, Christianity is only one of those views. People can be Jews or Muslims or Sikhs, and there's various other people who believe there is a creator, a supernatural creator. But ultimately it boils down to only two possibilities. A third possibility used to be entertained by scientists, and particularly some of the cosmologists, and that was that things were eternal. So the universe was eternal, but that's no longer an option. So there's only two possibilities. Either things made themselves, there was a beginning, but some way or other they made themselves, or an eternal, powerful creator made everything. Well, tonight I was asked to talk about biology. I'm a biologist, and one of my favourite trees is a mango tree, and I have one in my backyard, in fact. Now, eat your hearts out. It's really enjoyable eating the fruits of my labour. But God created fruit trees, it says in the Bible, producing fruit with seed in them after their kind. Now, my research actually involved mango trees, lychees, or lychee, you would say here, custard apples, a whole range of other fruit that you can't grow here. But I remember hearing about Wageningen University when I was a student many times, because it's a world centre of excellence with particularly things like floriculture. And so Wageningen University came up frequently, but not for tropical fruit. Leastways you can't do it very well here. And so these tropical fruit like mangoes and so on, one of my research things was on looking at the flowering and how the environment controls the flowering of the trees, and then how growers can manipulate the flowering to make them fruit more regularly, because they're quite irregular at fruiting, especially lychees or lychee. But the Bible, interestingly, the first life that the Bible says God created were fruit trees. And they were to produce fruit with seed in them after their kind. And of course, if you take a mango seed and you plant it, what do you get? No trick questions here, it's quite simple. A mango tree. And this is what this is talking about. God made fruit trees producing fruit with seed in them after their kind. You plant a mango seed, you get a mango tree. And 10 times in Genesis chapter 1 it says God made things after their kind. Sea creatures, land creatures, birds and so on, after their kind, humans and so on. But the evolutionary story is that things don't breed true to their kind. They change one thing into another. In fact, Simon Conway Morris in New Scientist said once we were worms. This is the idea that worms change into people. Not that you have worms, right? But worms change into people. I'll come back to this in a little while. In this big story, elephants and mice had a common ancestor. If you trace the ancestors of elephants and mice backwards in time, the claim is there would be a creature that existed that was neither elephant nor mouse that gave rise to both of them. In fact, whales, dolphins and things in the sea, where did they come from? Well, they must have been land animals, and so there was some land animal changed back into a sea creature. And so the story goes that cattle and whales and things are related evolutionarily. They had common ancestor back in the past. And I do a bit of surfing with my daughter and son down the Gold Coast. That was that picture of the waves there early on before I started talking. And I'd be really surprised one day if I saw this. you know. But the story of evolution is that cows and dolphins had a common ancestor in the past. In fact, at one stage, cows were considered the most closely related to dolphins of the land creatures. Well, what we know today about how genetics and biology works is that they can't change one thing into the other. In fact, it's got to do with the information in living things. If you're going to construct a building or anything complex, you need specifications, or specifications of living things, of course, are written on their DNA, and you all know that. But what about the simplest living thing, the simplest microbe that can reproduce itself? How much information are we talking? We're talking about a book of 500 pages of close typed information to specify how to make the simplest microbe that can reproduce itself. Now, that's incredibly complex. In fact, scientists have been trying to work out how simple it can be and still reproduce, and much to the annoyance of quite some people, they've found that it needs about 400 genes to actually be able to reproduce itself. And that's a huge problem for the story that life made itself, and we're not going to deal with that in detail, but let's just assume that life made itself, and I don't have enough faith to believe that. The simplest living thing is incredibly, incredibly complex. But the story of evolution is that that microbe changed into every living thing on Earth by natural processes, by how? Physics and chemistry, basically. And so that microbe changed into a horse. But to change into a horse, it needs to add lots of information that specifies things that horses have that microbes don't have, like muscle and nerve fibres and bone and all the other things, not to mention the sequence of events that occur when the horse is an embryo, starts from a single cell and then develops into a multi-celled and complex creature. The sequence of events in the mother's womb, absolutely incredible. How much information are we talking about in a human? We're talking about 1,000 books of DNA information which has been decoded in the human. So when we talk about information, what are we talking about? We're talking about specifications or specified complexity. If we think about it this way, this string in English, she has an automobile, 21 letters. It has relatively low specified information, but what about this one? This is the same letters reorganised in a randomised, same number of letters, has 0 specified information, same number of letters. Sue has a red Porsche. Compared to that, does it contain more information? Of course it does. It has the highest specified information. Now, what those people who like to popularise evolution like to say is that this here contains information, but in fact it contains no specified complexity. And so if you actually randomise, in fact if you look at the actual information in this has actually got more information than this. If you work out the number of bits required to transmit it, the random sequence has more information than one which has high specified complexity. And so if you add random mutations to things, you actually increase the information in this Shannon sense they're talking about. But in the sense of specified complexity, being able to specify how to make proteins, enzymes, components of cells, and all that sort of thing, adding randomness actually removes the information. That's an important thing. See, if I showed you this picture here, you've seen this, at least pictures of it, Mount Rushmore in the United States, and I said to you, look at what the wind and the rain has carved over millions of years. You'd say, oh, you've lost it. A person carved this over many years. And so how do you know that it was a person carved it rather than the wind and the rain? Natural processes. How do you intuitively know that? How do you know? You know because these rocks are representing something other than rocks. They're standing for something. They're conveying a picture about something which is not rocky, if you like. And that's what the DNA is like. The information on the DNA isn't a part of the chemistry of the DNA, in a sense that the chemistry of the DNA doesn't create the information. The information is imposed upon it, just like the information is imposed upon these rocks by intelligence. And so the information of the DNA is like that. So what's the explanation for adding 999 books of information to a microbe to make it into a microbiologist, which is a claim of evolution? They say mutations and natural selection created all the information to change it one thing into the other. But what are mutations? They're accidental changes in the DNA information. When you get your DNA from your parents, that's inherited, the birds and the bees, mistakes are made in copying the information. You get half of it from dad and half of it from mum, approximately. And so when a mistake is made and a letter is changed in the DNA, that's a mutation. So the mutations are supposed to create all the information, but would you expect random changes, accidental changes in the information to create 999 books of coded specifications to change a microbe into you and me? You wouldn't. Intuitively, you wouldn't. In fact, Carl Sagan many years ago recognised this as an atheist and an evolutionist. He said mutations occur at random and are almost always universally harmful. It is rare that a precision machine, like a living thing, is improved by a random change in the instructions for making it. In fact, here's an example of a mutant. It's a rooster with no feathers. Now, a mutation in the information for making feathers, or specifications for making feathers, results in a rooster that can't make feathers. Is the rooster improved? The point of view of the chicken farmer, it might be, because he doesn't have to pluck it. The point of view of the rooster, it's going to fry in summer and freeze in winter. There's not much of an improvement for the rooster. And this is very technical. You ready for it? The TNR mutant, it stands for totally naked rooster. In fact, we have over 1,000 human diseases caused by mutations. There's a whole website devoted to the mutations that cause disease. Cystic fibrosis caused by one-letter error in the DNA in the wrong spot. Thankfully, not all mutations are that disastrous, otherwise we wouldn't be here. Why do I say that? Because we are actually inheriting something like 50 to 100 new mutations every generation from our parents. Not inheriting them, they're actually being created in the process. And so, we'll get back to this later, but in fact this mutational load is wrecking us, not creating us. It's a huge problem for the evolutionary story. But then I hear someone saying, perhaps under their breath, but there's antibiotic resistance, that's evolution in action. Let me show you what happens with this sort of thing. One of the major sources of antibiotic resistance is bacteria actually swap material, and the ones that already have it swap the plasmids, they're called, loops of DNA, with the antibiotic resistance. But where they are due to new mutations, this is the sort of process that goes on. This represents a bacterial cell. Here the antibiotic with the skull and crossbones represented. We have an enzyme factory. The little green things here, Pac-Men, they represent enzymes that will break down the antibiotic, like penicillin. This is a typical way in which antibiotic resistance occurs. And the factory normally produces a small amount of the enzyme, but not sufficient to break down all the antibiotic. And so this is the way it works. So, by the way, living things don't produce smoke, but just to indicate the idea of a factory producing the enzyme. But not enough of the enzyme to inactivate all the antibiotic, and it succumbs to the antibiotic and it dies, which is what you want to happen if you're sick with some disease. But a mutation in the control system for the enzyme manufacturer results in the enzyme being produced out of control. So whereas before the cell produced a small amount of this enzyme which had a normal purpose other than inactivating the antibiotic, but it happens to inactivate the antibiotic, but now, produced out of control, it produces lots of the enzyme, and because it's producing heaps of the enzyme, it's able to inactivate all the antibiotic and it's resistant. You see, a defect in the control system for producing the antibiotic results in antibiotic resistance. And defects can be useful, but defects do not explain how you add specifications for making nerve fibres and things when microbes don't have them. So there are examples of beneficial mutations, there are examples of adaptive mutations, but you're hard-pressed to find any mutations that will create what we need to make evolution believable. Because random changes do not create coded, specified information. For example, just inside you right now, a delivery system is delivering packages of proteins inside your cells. And this is an animation of this. It's called kinesin or kinesin. It walks around on a road network of microtubules, which are a type of protein. And the kinesin itself, in fact, is a protein of 300 amino acids. You know, there are 20 different amino acids, and 300 in the correct order produce this. And it uses one ATP, which of course is a chemical compound that produces energy or provides energy. It uses one ATP molecule for every step. Now, there are 125,000 steps in a millimetre, so it would take a while to walk a long way, but inside our cells, of course, which are very small, it delivers packages quite efficiently. Inside the package here are proteins. The proteins are actually manufactured with an address label which says where they're to go to, and then they're packaged up together, a bit like the mail sorting centre, to go to particular destinations in our cells or outside our cells. Now, to go from a prokaryote, like a simple bacterium so-called, to a eukaryote, you have to invent this system, because all eukaryotes have this system. Now, you've got to have the packaging system. You've got to recognise the address labels on the proteins. The proteins have to be manufactured with address labels. How'd that come about? You've got to have the road network. The kinesin has to know where to go to. Nobody quite knows how that happens yet, but this is what happens. In fact, anybody remember labelling the Golgi apparatus in the cell? First year biology 101, you had a cell and you label all the components, you know, nucleus, nucleolus, mitochondria and all that sort of stuff. Anybody remember doing that? You remember labelling Golgi apparatus or Golgi apparatus? You remember that? No A students here, okay? Well, the Golgi apparatus, what's known now, just in the last few years this has been discovered, one of the things the Golgi apparatus does is the packaging and the sorting process for the proteins to put them into the vesicle so they can be delivered to the different parts of the cell. Now, folks, I can't for the life of me conceive how any lucky accidents could even get started on inventing this, which is what mutations are. They're accidental changes to the information. See, even to get 300 amino acids lined up in the right order to get the kinesin is beyond chance. You can do the sums. Someone says, oh, but you don't need all 300. Yeah, we'll just do the sums with 100, for example. It still doesn't work. It still doesn't work. So it screams intelligent design, and everything we're looking at today inside cells is screaming super intelligent design. In fact, some years ago, before this was actually discovered, Richard Dawkins said this: biology is a study of complicated things that give the appearance of having been designed for a purpose. Well, why doesn't he accept that they are designed for a purpose rather than suggest that they just appear to be designed for a purpose? Well, because he's an atheist. And if you're an atheist, the only game in town for being an atheist and not burying your head in the sand is evolution. And so he has to deny the design in things because design speaks about a designer. That's the fundamental problem. But Antony Flew, this guy here, was he was actually called the world's most notorious atheist. He was always rubbishing Christianity and so on. But he actually came to the point of understanding that there must be a creator. He said, it now seems to me that the findings of more than 50 years of DNA research have provided materials for a new and enormously powerful argument to design. This research has shown, by the almost unbelievable complexity of the arrangements which are needed to produce life, that intelligence must have been involved. And he wrote a book, There Is a God, rather than There Is No God. And so Antony Flew recognised the powerful evidence from design that design demands a designer. And a designer of living things is far above us. In fact, if I showed you this vase of flowers, and I said, look at the vase. You see, I was out in the woods one day, walking, and I saw a pile of sand. And in the pile of sand was this vase, a beautiful vase. And I thought, wow, look at what a lightning strike has created in the pile of sand. A lightning strike has created a vase. Isn't that amazing? Now, I've lost it again, haven't I? You say, come on, somebody made that. Intelligence was behind the vase. Well, what about the flowers in the vase, which Wageningen University is famous for, research in this area? What about the flowers in the vase? Oh, they made themselves. They're far more complex than the vase. They leave the vase in the shadow. The shadows in terms of the specified complexity and the sophistication of what's inside them. The problem is the flowers show too much design. That's the problem. If the flowers could be explained by human agency, there'd be no problem. But a human agency can't explain the flowers. It demands a supernatural, super intelligent creator beyond our ability. Well, okay, that's mutations. Mutations aren't up to the job. What about natural selection? It's often held up as being evolution. Here's an example of natural selection, say people like Richard Dawkins and many others. This is evolution in action, get over it. So here's an example of natural selection, that's evolution, that's all it is. Well, I beg to differ. I believe natural selection happens in today's world, but it's not evolution. And let me show you why. Here's a couple of wolves, friendly looking wolves or dogs, and these red things represent genes for hair length, and this is very simplified, and these genes are co-dominant. So, sorry, incomplete dominance, not co-dominant, incomplete dominance. The geneticists know what I'm talking about. But anyway, if you're not a geneticist, don't worry. You'll understand the point. But if you get a short-haired gene together, a short-haired gene from dad and a short-haired gene from mum, you get a short-haired offspring, okay, like this. This is an effect of recombination during sexual reproduction. Okay, if you get a short-haired gene with a long-haired gene, either way around, you're going to get 50% of them are going to be just like mum and dad. You get a long-haired gene with a long-haired gene, what do you get? I'm a long hair. Okay, which ones are adapted to cold conditions? Okay, the long-haired ones, it's not difficult, is it? So here they are during your last winter. It's long, cold winter. And which ones are best? Which ones survive? Well, the ones over on the right survive, don't they? Incredibly cold conditions. And of course they reproduce. What can they produce when they reproduce? They can only produce long-haired ones, can't they? They can only produce long-haired offspring because the short-haired gene's been eliminated by natural selection. Now, here's the point. Natural selection does not create anything. All it does is sort existing genetic information. It doesn't create anything. The only game in town to create the information that evolution needs to be believable are mutations. And there are many different sorts of mutations, but they're all accidental changes to the existing information. So natural selection is not evolution. And to call it evolution is, I believe, deceitful. And so here's a problem. And natural selection only sorts existing information. Mutations and natural selection are not evolution and not up to the challenge of explaining how microbes change into microbiologists. Evolution has no mechanism. Now, Darwin argued that variation in living things was evolution. And for example, he argued that dogs show evolution or show the potential for evolution. And when you look at dogs, you see some variety, like for example, a Chihuahua and a Great Dane. Quite some variety. And so the argument goes in biology lessons at universities around the world. I see evolution happening in my lab. It's a fact, talking about some variations in moths or fruit flies or something, and the poor student thinks the professor's talking about microbes changing into mankind. But you don't observe that in the lab. You see lots of variation. This is called equivocation or bait and switch. It's a trick, an argumentative trick to try and get people to believe in evolution. Another trick is to look up the dictionary and look up and say, oh, evolution just means change. Here's an example of change. Evolution is a fact. Accept it. And evolution isn't just change. I believe in change too. Things do change, but not in the way evolution requires. Dogs do change. What into? Different dogs. In fact, nobody has ever observed one basic kind of creature or plant or anything changing into something else. The most established principle of biology, an experiment that's been repeated countless billions of times, is that like produces like. Things reproduce after their kind. I mean, just take humans, for example. We have, 7 billion people on Earth today. There's 7 billion experiments where people have produced people in terms of reproduction. And dogs have produced dogs, and cats have produced cats, and so on and so on. Mangoes produce mangoes. It's the most established biological experiment ever. But evolution is a belief that things change into other things given enough time. But mutations aren't up to it. Natural selection is not evolution. What's the mechanism for this? Of course, what's usually shown up in biology lessons is something like this. Oh, look at the finches in the Galapagos Islands. You've got all these different beak sizes. I mean, that's evolution. No, that's not evolution. They're still finches. We've got different varieties of beaks and finches, but they haven't changed into something else. You get variation within a kind. It's not evolution. In fact, one evolutionist actually said this. Now, we can go on examining natural variation at all levels, as well as hypothesising about speciation events in bedbugs, bears and brachiopods until the planet reaches oblivion. But we still only end up with bedbugs, brachiopods and bears. None of these body plans will transform into rotifers, roundworms or rhynchoceles. In fact, we see lots of varieties of people. See a few varieties of people here tonight. We see varieties of frogs and varieties of horses and varieties of palm trees and dogs, which includes wolves, of course. They're just a wolf derivative. But we don't see evidence of one thing changing into another. Well, what are these created kinds the Bible talks about? How can we define them biologically? Well, the created kind, or in the Hebrew, baramin, created kind, that's where the word baramin comes from, baramin. But the biologist, creationist biologist Dr. Frank Marsh suggested this. He said 2 species that will hybridise to produce at least an embryo are the same created kind, or baramin, recognising that since creation things have changed, degenerated and so on, and so there could be breeding barriers and things, or partial breeding barriers at least, indicating these changes since creation. So for example, take horse family, for example, equity. We have zebras and donkeys and horses and Przewalski's horse and a range of others, which all interbreed, at least to some extent, to produce an embryo, and even the ass, which is usually infertile, sometimes is fertile. And so different chromosome numbers are responsible for the incomplete fertility between them, but from our point of view, my point of view, these all would be derived from the original created kind, original baramin. And so what we're looking at here, in terms of the history of the Earth, are created kinds, and over time diversifying into what we see as today's species. And so we're not talking about fixity of species. So this is the evolutionary idea that a chance origin of life changed all the things on Earth we see today. they usually put up a false caricature, a false picture of the creationist view. And they say those stupid creationists, they believe that God created everything we see today, everything we see today originally as it was, and no changes occurred. Now, nobody, I don't think, believed that. In fact, even back to the time of Linnaeus, well before Darwin, Linnaeus recognised that this view was actually what happened. It wasn't this idea here, which really comes from Greek Aristotelian philosophy rather than the Bible or anything like that. So what we talk about here is often the biblical kind is best represented by the family, sometimes the genus. In some of the birds is actually in the order, a level of order. But we could go into more detail about that, but I want to talk about some other things. So I said that living things don't show that changes one thing into the other. What about fossils? Do they show things changing one thing into the other? Because this is where the claim arises that over millions of years, the fossils actually record things changing one into the other. Well, this is actually a paper in Science, 1999. Paul Sereno was considered the world's top expert in dinosaur evolution. He's asked to write a review about dinosaur evolution for Science Journal, which is the #2 science journal in the world. Scientists get paper in Science, they get a tick next to their name. It's pretty good stuff. So here he's written this review, and here's a diagram showing the evolution of dinosaurs, summarising it. Here they have different sorts of dinosaurs up the top here. You have the stegosaurs. You've all heard of stegosaurs, haven't you? And up here, Brachiosaurus, and so on. You know, you've got the different kinds of dinosaurs up here. I would say that, in fact, Brachiosaurs and Diplodocus and Apatosaurs are all actually in the same kind. But anyway, we won't go into get picky about this. But anyway, these are the different sorts of dinosaurs up here, according to Paul Sereno. And here's the family tree showing how they're all linked back to a common ancestor of the Dinosauria down here. Now notice something, the black lines, black bars actually represent the fossil evidence. You see that? So the fossil evidence down through the rock layers. Now the open bars and the dashed lines represent the family tree, the dinosaurs, which actually is not based on fossil evidence. Let me colour in the imagination that's actually not based on fossil evidence. And now lets me erase the imagination from the diagram that's not based on fossils. And I remove the imagination. What have I removed? The evolutionary story. Okay, the fossils don't show evolution. It's imposed on the fossils by the evolutionary doctrine. In fact, some years ago, Dr. Colin Patterson, who was senior paleontologist at the British Museum of Natural History, wrote a book about evolution. In the book, he didn't have any pictures of transitional fossils that illustrated, you know, ape men or anything like that. And he was asked about that, and he said, "I fully agree with your comments on the lack of direct illustrations of evolutionary transitions in my book. If I knew of any fossil or living, I would certainly have included them." He goes on to say, yet Gould in the American Museum people, this is Stephen J. Gould at Chicago, the American Field Museum of Natural History, and Niles Eldridge and others, are hard to contradict when they say there are no transitional fossils. I will lay it on the line, there's not one such fossil which one can make a watertight argument. Of course, if you go to that wonderful authoritative source called Wikipedia, which is edited by amateurs, you will find a list of transitional fossils there. But when you actually go looking at each one individually, you find nearly all of them are actually what we call variation within a kind. And the ones that aren't don't stack up. Even the evolutionists disagree about them. But there should be millions of transitional fossils if evolution were true. There should be more transitional fossils than there are, in fact, fossils of the creatures. For example, if we go back here, there are thousands of fossils of these. You can't argue that lack of fossils is the reason for the lack of the transitional fossils. In fact, where the fossil record is most complete, such with fish, for example, the absence of transitional fossils is most pronounced and most obvious. And so don't be hoodwinked about this. Now, there's something else about the fossils which actually contradicts the evolutionary story as well. And that is that when we look at the fossils, we don't see things changing one thing into the other, but we see heaps of examples of things that actually haven't changed. Now this is a dragonfly fossil, supposedly 200 million years old, and this is the fossil obviously here, and underneath it I have a picture of a modern dragonfly. When we strip away the rock from around the wing, the fossilised wing, like this, we have, in fact, a wing which is almost identical to modern dragonfly's wing. In fact, that's just one of many. In fact, if you look at what they call the Cambrian Sea, it's full of things which are still around today. Things like starfish and jellyfish and sponges and crinoids and clams and brachiopods, sea urchins, and stacks of things which you still find in the ocean today, apparently unchanged. Over how long? Over 500 million years. And in that time, a worm is supposed to have changed into people, and elephants and mice and dinosaurs and birds and all the fish and etc. And yet these things have stayed the same. After their kind, after their kind, after their kind. There are thousands of examples of these things. In fact, here is a fossilised worm, Picaya, supposedly 525 million years old. This is a creature that Simon Conway Morris said evolved into all the chordates. That's you and me and fish and birds and so on, everything with a backbone. And here's the living one, still around today, Amphioxus. It's as far as we can tell, identical. So it hasn't changed, and yet it's supposed to have evolved. It changed so much, it's evolved into all the living things on Earth. Folks, it's storytelling. It's storytelling. So here's another claim for evolution. The claim is similarities between living things are evidence for evolution. And you might have seen this in your biology course too. We have a human limb and a frog's limb, and you see there's parallels here. You've got one bone here, 2 bones there, 2 bones there. You've got 5 digits, and so on. And the claim is, oh, well, that's obviously because they had a common ancestor. So reasoning backwards from what we see today. Of course, you look at a horse limb, it's quite different to a frog's limb, and yet a horse is a mammal, supposedly much more closely related to humans than frogs. So how come a horse looks quite different? Oh, that's because it's adapted to a different way of walking. Storytelling. Fruit bat also adapted to a different thing because it flies and so on. But if we had a common ancestor with a frog, and that was the reason that we had a similar limb pattern, there should be a similar process to arrive at this pattern in embryo development. But here's another thing I want to say. About this whole issue of similarity, there's another reason why things could be similar other than evolution, but this is ruled out of court because why? Well, it involves God. And that's this, that these two cars, the original VW and the original Porsche, neither of which are these, but I couldn't find nice pictures of them, but the original VW Beetle and the original Porsche both had many similarities because they're both designed by Dr. Porsche. Not because they had a common ancestor, but they had a common creator. Now perhaps the similarities we see in living things are due to a common creator, not to common ancestry. In fact, there's a good reason for that. In fact, I believe the creator has put patterns there which contradict the evolutionary story, so we don't get misled. For example, as I said, with a frog and a human, the development of the 5-digit pattern should be by the same process if it's due to common ancestry, but it isn't. In a human embryo, a human fetus in its mother's womb forms a bony plate, and the material between the fingers and toes dissolves to produce the toes and fingers. With a frog, however, amphibians, little buds form, and the buds grow outwards to produce the toes. So you have a different process arriving at the same or similar pattern. And I believe that sort of pattern has been put there in many things to actually tell us that this similarities are due to a common creator rather than common ancestry. In fact, here's another profound example of similarities. Placental mammals and marsupial mammals. You have a wombat and a groundhog, anteater, mole, mouse. In fact, you've got to pick it up and look for the pouch to almost tell the difference. They're so similar. But here's a problem for the evolutionary story, is that these things, these two didn't have a common ancestor. In fact, the mammals, marsupial mammals and placental mammals, supposedly had a common ancestor way back before each of them developed, before all the different types developed or evolved. And so you have to sort of say, well, these similarities here are just chance. The fact that we've got a marsupial mouse and placental mouse, a marsupial mole, placental mole, is just chance. That's all it is. They supposedly evolved to fill a similar niche. And many other examples of this sort of similarity which is not due to evolution. And this example, for mako shark and bluefin tuna, for example, they have strong muscles attached to their fin with tendons, and the muscles are in the body of the fish to enable them to actually produce heaps of energy, heaps of power to drive the tail efficiently. Not due to common ancestry. So, sorry, this is sort of out of order. Anyway, this is the way this reasoning goes with evolution. They observe similarities between two organisms, and they ask the question, is this possibly due to common ancestor? If the answer is yes, it could be due to a common ancestor, then it's called homology and it's claimed evidence for evolution. We're similar to chimpanzees because we had a common ancestor with them. And by the way, you probably heard that we're 99% the same as chimpanzees in our DNA, which is rubbish. We're actually less than 80% similar in our DNA. That 99% figure came from way back before the DNA was actually decoded properly. But anyway, that's just an aside. And then the question, if it's no, the similarities could not be due to a common ancestor. For example, some of the similarities we just looked at. If the answer is no, then it's called homoplasy, and then it's called evidence for convergent evolution or parallel evolution. So in other words, no matter what the evidence, everything is evidence for evolution. And that's not science, it's storytelling. So here's something else. This homoplasy, the similarities which aren't due to common ancestry, applies to eyes. In fact, the camera-style eye, what do I mean by that? It has a lens, an iris, a retina, spherical shape, light sensor layer, nerves, and a brain to interpret it. Then you have numerous different types of eye, it's a similar type of eye evolving independently 6 times. And then eyes themselves evolving independently 40 times plus. So this is incredible similarity which evolution has a huge problem with. In fact, evolutionists wrote a book about homoplasy. Sorry?
What do you mean it has a problem with it? Evolution just explains it.
Well, let me just continue because this is actually, by the evolutionists, about homoplasy, okay? I can tell you're troubled. We're going to have a time at the end, okay?
Yeah, no, it's okay. I was just waiting my time, but it's...
Yeah, you've done well so far. Yeah.
I'm really trying to hold back.
Yeah, you're doing well. Well, here's a book by the evolutionists about homoplasy, okay, with similarities which are not due to evolution in the sense of common ancestry. And it says, homoplasy remains a concept that evokes strong reactions amongst evolutionists. It is variously and inconsistently seen as fascinating, inexplicable, or downright annoying. Homoplasy is tied to long-standing, unresolved disagreements about the origin of similarity amongst organisms. And I could quote other bits from this too, but it's not a lecture specific about this. But so the problem is, it is a problem for evolution because if similarities are actually due to common ancestry or argued as evidence for common ancestry, what about the multiple similarities which aren't due to common ancestry? Perhaps the similarities which are claimed to be due to common ancestry aren't either. And so that's the point. If there's masses of similarities which are not due to common ancestry, then what about the similarities which are claimed to be due to common ancestry? I think logically you'd have to say you can't claim them as due to common ancestry. I claim them as due to common creator. The last thing I want to talk about before I close my talk, is the issue of genetic entropy problem. And that is that we are receiving from humans are getting something like 100 new mutations, 50 to 100 depending on who measures it, new mutations per person. In other words, you are a degenerate mutant misfit compared to your parents, and they are compared to their parents. But we've got 3,000 million base pairs on our DNA, 3,000 million letters, if you like, in the information. So on average, a mutation in one letter is not going to kill us. So there are mutations which, you can't really see their effect. But they're still randomly changing the information, and so they're slightly deleterious. And Kondrashov has researched this at length, and you can look up his papers, and other people have taken this up recently as well. But here's the basic problem. There we go. This is a book up there. Have we got the book? Genetic Entropy? Don't have it. Okay. It's available though. You can get it through the internet, through creation.com, but other places as well. But if you draw a graph of the frequency of mutations and their effect, this is a no selection zone for natural selection, because natural selection can't see them. They're too small an effect. If you have a mutation which kills you before you reproduce, well, that's natural selection can see it. And you don't pass on the defect to your offspring. That's natural selection. But the vast majority of mutations aren't that bad, and they're only slightly bad. And so natural selection can't select for them. In fact, because we've got at least 50, maybe 100, then it's impossible for natural selection to get rid of them. And even sexual recombination can't get rid of them. And originally, the idea was, because of the assumption of evolution, they assumed that we must have less than 0.3 mutations on average added per generation. But measurements show many more. And this is a huge problem for the evolutionary story, because it means we are degenerating. We're not evolving upwards to some perfection in the future, but we are degenerating. In fact, all higher organisms are degenerating, like wolves and tigers and lions and elephants and everything are actually degenerating because of these mutations. And that points back to perfection in the past, not perfection in the future, quite contrary to the evolutionary account of history. So there's a no selection zone, and the vast majority of the mutations are in this zone, so they can't be. And what we've got here is a positive mutation. This is a beneficial mutation. There's actually much less than that, but if you drew it at actual size, you wouldn't be able to see it. So here's beneficial mutations. Here's the negative mutations, but most of them are tiny, tiny effect. Now, they're like rust on your car. If you own a car, or your bicycle or whatever, and it has a rust spot on it, it doesn't stop it from working. If you have 2 rust spots on it, it doesn't stop it from working. But over 50 years, when you get enough rust spots on it, and they all coalesce together, your car falls apart, or your bicycle falls apart, okay? And then it stops working. That's what we're talking about here. This genetic entropy is actually destroying us. And John Sanford, the guy who wrote this book, Dr. John Sanford actually is one who invented the gene gun that's been used for genetic transformation of plants. Roundup resistant soybeans, for example. John Sanford was a co-inventor of the gene gun that's actually used for that. So he's a geneticist. He says all higher organisms are heading for extinction in a short time frame. In fact, Kondrashov, the Russian geneticist I just quoted a while ago, says, why aren't we dead 100 times over? Because he's got the evolutionary mind frame in terms of the timing and everything. And so why aren't we dead 100 times over with all these mutations? Well, I suggest we haven't been here for millions of years, or even 1 million years, or even 100,000 years, and that's why we're not dead already. But Kondrashov, of course, accepts the evolutionary time frame. But John Sanford doesn't accept that time frame anymore. He used to. And John Sanford said, one of my reviewers told me that the message of this book is both terrifying and depressing. He suggests that perhaps I am a little bit like a sadistic steward on the board the Titanic, gleefully spreading the news that the ship is sinking. That is not correct. I hate the consequences of entropy, degeneration. I hate to see it in my own body. We can see it in my body. in the failing health of loved ones or in the deformity of a newborn baby, I find it also absolutely ghastly, but also absolutely undeniable. Surely a real steward on the Titanic would have a responsibility to let people know that the ship was sinking, even if some people might hate him for it. I feel like I'm in that position. Responsible people should be grateful to know the bad news so they can constructively respond to it. If we have been putting all our hope in a sinking ship, would it be not expedient to recognise this and abandon the false hope? It is only in this light that we can appreciate bad news. Only in the light of the bad news can we really appreciate the good news that there is a lifeboat. And he's speaking as a Christian about the lifeboat that's available, that God has provided for us in Jesus Christ. So why the enthusiasm for the evolutionary story if it really doesn't stack up biologically? Well, as Richard, I missed this here. Dr. Sanford says, I believe the author of life has the power to defeat death and degeneration. He gave us life in the first place so he can give us new life. I humbly put before you this alternative paradigm for your consideration. Jesus is our one true hope. So why the enthusiasm for the evolutionary story? Well, as Richard Dawkins says, Darwin made it possible to be an intellectually fulfilled atheist. And this billboard in Arizona says it all. Praise Darwin, evolved beyond belief, from the Freedom from Religion Foundation. The reason for the enthusiasm for evolution is not because it's biologically sound, but because it's seen to get rid of God. And so I submit to you that's the main reason for this story. In fact, that's not going to play, so there's not much point playing that. C.S. Lewis, who was an atheist, and he said this, he became a Christian. Does the whole vast structure of modern naturalism depend not on positive evidence, but simply on an a priori metaphysical prejudice? Was it devised not to get in facts, but to keep out God? I suggest to you that's the main purpose of the evolutionary thing, is actually to keep out God. So I think time's up, and you wanted to have time for some discussion, and you wanted to take up some issues and open them up. So
yes, I think we'll have a short break first,
yep.
and then we'll have